Hello everyone and welcome back to Tactics Board, the first episode of a new season, because tomorrow the Championship is back for Norwich City. Millwall travel to Carrow Road to take on the Canaries in a 3 p.m. kickoff that should be very interesting for a variety of reasons. The Canaries have made 11 new signings already this summer. Liam Manning, of course, a new head coach who will be taking charge of his team in a competitive game for the first time tomorrow. And here on Tactics Board, I'm going to predict the team that I think he'll pick for the game, take a little bit of a look at Millwall and how the game might pan out given some of their strengths and weaknesses, and then come on to some of the general trends I've noticed from Liam Manning and how he sets up his team as Norwich boss. I think we did a video a couple of months ago when it looked like Manning was going to be appointed and outlined just the sort of typical tactical trends of his career so far, but he's done some really interesting stuff specifically in reference to the players he's now got available to him at Norwich, which we're going to take a look at in further detail. But for now, we're going to begin with the starting 11. So without further ado, here it is. So I've gone for a 3-4-3 with Vladan Kovacevic in goal, Jakov Medic, Harry Darling and Jose Cordoba in the centre of defence. Jack Stacey at right wing back, a midfield two of Jacob Wright and Marcelino Nunez, with Papa Amadou Diallo on the left wing and Ante Sienats and Amankwa Forson just behind Josh Sargent. Now, I've only made the one change from last week's pre-season friendly against NAC Breda. Of course, that went pretty well, a 2-0 win, quite a solid performance, and probably the game that so far, or throughout pre-season really, married sort of defensive strength and attacking strength the best. Obviously, they scored a couple of early goals and then were quite comfortable, but I thought the press was good. Defensively, they didn't concede too many chances. There were a couple, but they did look relatively solid, but also they created more than they had in, I think, any of the other games in pre-season, to be honest. So they seem to get the balance right with that 11. The only change I've gone for is Jose Cordoba over Ben Krezene. I think probably there was a fitness question mark over him going into that Breda game. Krezene started in a sort of unfamiliar centre-back position, although the way that Manning plays, they rotate so that Krezene was actually playing in his more natural left-back area quite often. But then Cordoba came on at half-time, no problems with him, thought he looked pretty solid there. And even though there is that rotation with the centre-backs going very wide at times and acting like full-backs, I think Cordoba is still a more natural defender, not only out of possession and in terms of his physical attributes, but in possession. He's probably got that, more of that distribution, which maybe Krezene hasn't had to use too much as a left-back, because obviously he's normally a sort of secondary option that the centre-backs would look to once they've already received the ball, rather than being in that position, having to start attacks and having to dictate things. So I think in that sense, Cordoba is still a sort of is a more natural option in that area. And then in terms of the other areas, I think they've got a few players who maybe they'd like to include if they were a little bit more fit. Matthias Kvistgaarden, obviously one of the marquee signings of the summer, but has only played around 20 minutes, I think, so far. So you probably can't bank on him to play, well, certainly not to start in this game, but probably not to play too long in it either. Matej Jurasek still coming back from obviously an extended injury absence with a few different problems that he's now come back from, and I thought looked quite good a few times in pre-season, but isn't quite at that fitness level. And I think the rest of the team kind of speaks for itself, really. There's the Marcelino Nunez issue. Of course, yesterday morning there were reports of interest in Trabzonspor. Our understanding is that Norwich are open to selling, but right now there haven't been any club-to-club approaches to Ben Napper for Nunez's services, even though the interest is there. And I think probably with Kenny McLean out injured, it comes down to a choice between him and Mirko Topic. I do get the feeling Topic is going to come in and be a starter before too long, but he's only been in the building now for, I think, 5 days. He's obviously never played in England before. His last experience was in Portugal, which is quite a different league. So although I wouldn't completely rule out Manning starting Topic, because with the situation over Nunez, that tells you maybe where they see him a little bit, I think it probably is just a little bit too early, which is why I've gone for Topic in there. In terms of the front three, I don't think many people would have had a Amankwa Forson sort of in the front three going into pre-season, but the way that Manning uses those number 10s, he's been really, really good. I thought he was absolutely excellent against Breda, so it looks like he is nailed on to be in the team. He's had a lot of praise from Manning, and then up front, as long as Josh Sargent is a Norwich City player, he'll start. So we'll see how much longer that's for. But for now, obviously, he's going to be a Norwich player tomorrow. So, yeah, I think he'll start up front. And probably, although Manning hasn't revealed who he's going to choose as his captain yet with McLean's absence, I think it probably will be Sargent because he was in those last couple of games. So either way, it'll be interesting to see how the team or what team Manning picks. But I don't think it will be completely different to maybe what we've seen in the last couple of pre-season games. On to Millwall, and I think in many ways the sort of cliches around them as a club and Alex Neil as a manager actually ring true with their current style of play. Obviously, they've made a few changes in the transfer market as well, so you can't take loads from last season, but I think everyone of a Norwich City persuasion knows a bit of what Alex Neil wants from his teams. He wants them to be aggressive, to be front-footed, to get into the faces of opposition, but not necessarily to be completely attacking in their approach. They will vary things, which will make things a little bit harder for Liam Manning. Obviously, where we've seen him at his best previously as the Bristol City head coach, you look at those Norwich games and he spoke about Johannes Torp's side being a little bit predictable, so he knew what he could do with his team every time they passed the ball out from the back, and the numbers were incredibly high on Norwich doing that. I think they passed the ball out from the back from 82% of goal kicks last season, so that was a bit more predictable. Millwall don't really have that predictability, so Manning will have to trust his players, probably with 2 or 3 different instructions at least for different scenarios in which Millwall will play out. I'm sure they'll play out sometimes, they'll go long other times, but out of possession you can be pretty sure they'll press quite high a lot of the time. Obviously, Manning isn't afraid to go long either. His teams went long about half the time at Bristol City from goal kicks. So if Millwall do press high and they're causing Norwich problems in that sense, they will be set up to be able to go long if that's what they need to do. And I think one of the interesting areas that probably Millwall's weaknesses lend themselves to are midfield and that sort of number 10 position. I think watching some of their pre-season games, their press has been very good, but where they're vulnerable is leaving space in the middle. If they don't shuffle across quickly enough and their attackers don't rotate, they do leave a bit of a gap in the middle. So if Norwich can get those number 10s, Ante Sianats and Manquil Forson, into that space just behind the first line of the press, unless Millwall change something completely from the way that they were pressing in pre-season, there will be space there if Norwich can move it quickly from side to side in defence, and then someone like Harry Darling or Jose Cordoba can find that pass into midfield. But by absolutely no means will it be an easy test. Millwall are well drilled on set pieces. They had good numbers since in the second portion of last season when Alex Neil took over at the Den, so Norwich will have to be alive from those, although Manning did actually speak about those in his pre-match press conference as well, so you get the sense that might be more of a strength and more of a focus from last season. And ultimately I think it will be a really interesting matchup between these teams, because I think in some ways they can play really similarly. Norwich can press high and go long and be more physical if they want to, but also Manning, I think, wants to be more attacking, and if he could choose, he would be proactive, he would have the ball, he would be offensive, and in a home game on the first day of the season, I think that's what you want, really. So if Millwall aren't at their best, there will be the opportunities to exploit them in that way, but if their press is really good and they're doing really well in that sense, then Norwich might just have to protect themselves a little bit and go a little bit longer and prepare themselves for that. Just finally then, we'll dig a little bit deeper into what we've seen from Liam Manning and his Norwich side so far in pre-season. Some really interesting things actually that he's been doing with the team, and first and foremost I'd actually recommend going to read a piece by Ben Lee, who does tactical analysis for us on the Pink 'Un. He's back with his columns now that the season is back up and running, and he's taken a little bit of a look at some of the trends that Manning has used in pre-season and at clubs previously, so I'd recommend going to read that piece if you want a little bit more of this. But one thing that I find particularly interesting is that rotation in defence that I mentioned, because when you see Ben Krezene as a left centre-back, you do think, that's kind of a little bit strange, mostly a kind of attacking fullback who gets up and down. But the way that Norwich have operated, they've kind of gone between a back five and a back four. When they press high, one of the fullbacks tends to go really high. Currently, that's been Jack Stacey. Obviously, Kellen Fisher hasn't had too many minutes, so it looks like Stacey will be starting this weekend. And because he's that more attacking type of fullback, he tends to push on, and then the other three will be a little bit deeper, and Diallo, for example, who I've predicted to be in that left wing back position, will maybe be a little bit deeper as well. And then when Norwich are in more of a rested defence, that's when they're in more of a sort of 5-2-3 or a 5-3-2 at times. When they're pressing high, they like to go into a 4-4-2. So it will be often, as it was on Saturday, Seaman and Sargent pushing high, Jack Stacey going into the midfield four, and then Papa Amadou Diallo would drop into the back four with the back three, and then if the ball was on the left side, then Diallo would push forward into that left wing position. Jack Stacey would drop back into a back four, and I think those rotations out of possession are really interesting. I think in possession, actually, when you look at how Manning sets his team up, there's an interesting comparison, and that's David Wagner. I think Wagner had that desire to put players on the last line and to create overloads in an offensive sense. His fullbacks obviously played really, really high, so he did things in a slightly different way because he never really went to a back five at Norwich, but he kind of emptied out the midfield and put most of the players on the last line, and that's a little bit of what Manning does. He tends to sort of play the goalkeeper in those build-up phases slightly to the right or left of one of the centre-backs, and then they build up as kind of a back four or a back three a back four, sorry, with the goalkeeper, a couple in midfield, and then five on the last line to try to create those overloads. I think a lot of it is about overloads, but it does necessitate having central midfielders who are comfortable on the ball, who can come and receive it, because if you've only got two there and you haven't got too much of that support, especially if a team exploits that and tries to sort of flood the middle of the pitch and win balls in that area, then you need somebody, to be honest, like a Jacob Wright or a Marcelino Nunez, who has that technical quality and that calmness on the ball, that ability to turn as well, to kind of alleviate that pressure in an area that probably isn't, it doesn't have too many numbers in it, and where you can be exposed. So I think in possession there are some similarities there. I'm sure Manning will hope to do it a little bit more in a more entertaining fashion and maybe slightly more effectively than it was under Wagner. But I do find that an interesting comparison when you consider how different Norwich want their style of play to be now than it was under Wagner. Of course, not every tactical setup means that the football will be exactly the same, and Norwich will play through the lines slightly more than they did under Wagner. But it is interesting, that comparison, and there is definitely more of an onus on pushing players forward, trying to push the opposition back and creating overloads in the really dangerous areas, as opposed to Johannes Torp's system, which was more about wanting to build up successfully. So they had a lot of players deep when they took those goal kicks short, so that there were a lot of options and they could try to create the overload, maybe draw teams on to press them, and then play around it and find the space in behind, sort of in their own half even at times, or not too far into the opposition half. So that's quite an interesting difference. I think it will be interesting to see how things play out. Of course, we've spoken about that variety that Manning can produce from his teams, but you'd like to think, and Manning actually referenced in that pre-match press conference, that he wants to think about his team first and foremost. So hopefully it will be quite a proactive setup against Millwall, but definitely not an easy one to kick off the season. So it'll be an interesting test to see where they are. Thank you very much for joining me on Tactics Board. Of course, we'll have every kick of that game covered on the Pinken app and pinken.com. So if you haven't already, go to pinken.com/subscribe. We're currently running an offer where you can get a whole year's subscription for only £15. So pretty good value in my very biased opinion. So I'd recommend that. As I said, thank you very much for watching this video, and we'll see you very soon.